Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globaspan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globaspan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globaspan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globaspan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavors, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
So welcome viewers and listeners to another edition of Globaspan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Noir Singh. Tonight we are discussing the Indian narrative in Guyanese politics. Joining us for the discussion is Mr. Ravindra Dev and Professor Betaram Ramarat. Neither one is a stranger. Both are well known in the Guyanese and community as well as in the diaspora and the Indo community in general, Indo-Caribbean community in general. Our technical operator tonight, as usual, is Mr. Devin Bissoon. Viewers and listeners, thanks again for joining us. We will begin first with the definition discussion of narrative. It looks like Mr. Ramarat's screen is frozen. So, Devin, can you check into that, please? Or are you on, Betaram?
It's okay on our end.
It's okay from
good.
my
I
end.
can see and hear you guys. Yes, I'm okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. All right. So a narrative generally is a discussion, a viewpoint of one's perspective, and the Indian narrative would be the discussion, the perspective of the Indian community, writers in the Indian community, of their history, their politics, their contributions, their sociology to society. So first, I'd like to begin with Professor Ramarat. Do you want to define the Indian narrative before we go into the discussion of the Indian narrative in Guyana's politics?
Well, a couple of things. One, just to remind people who may be watching this show, is we're defining tonight, what that narrative is about. We have done some of this before, but I think it's important to take a step backwards first, right? To look at that word Indian before we get into that narrative. And essentially, we are a country made up of many different ethnic groups, right? People come from different backgrounds. So therefore, they have a different history, a different culture. So they interact. So all of those groups bring to the table a narrative. Now, if we can all say we share the same experience, we're all one, united in developing the society, then we can call ourselves Guyanese, right? But I want to make a distinction between the concept of Indian and the concept of being Guyanese. So when I say I'm Indian, and first to begin, let me just say, I don't see myself as defined as a West Indian or an East Indian. In the past, before that, you had other words that were being used to describe us. We were cargoes, we were hill coolies, and all of those things. But essentially, we are Indians. And what that means to me is that we come from a specific background. We share a specific history, right? So for me, for instance, what would be happening in India would be something that I would be concerned about, right? It would be of interest to me. I am also a Hindu. To show that, we are complex. So as a Hindu, I would say, look, there are people in Bangladesh today who are Hindus like myself, who are being persecuted. And I would hope and wish that the government of Guyana would respond in kind to those kinds of atrocities that are taking place currently. So my point here is that we are a complex set of people, but as an Indian, we have a specific narrative, right? Because of our historical experience. So when we say we are Guyanese, that implies that we are all living in a political space, right? We share the same space, and we should all have common aspirations, for instance, to develop the country, right? So when I say we're Guyanese, it means that we are saying we are citizens, right? We have certain basic rights as citizens in a country. So I want to make that distinction between being Indian and being Guyanese. So having said that, there are other people who have their own cultural background, right? We have the indigenous people, we have Africans, we have the Chinese and the Portuguese and so on. So I want to make that distinction. So to answer your question, when we say, what is an Indian narrative and what does that mean? It means that we have, based on our experience, based on our interaction with other people living in this geographical unit we call Guyana, it means that we have to, we share certain common interests, and those common interests should be recognized, right, by people in power, for instance. So we can say, look, we are Indian Guyanese, which is okay because Indian refers to your cultural background and Guyanese refers to, your ethnic background. That's what a lot of people say in the United States, for instance. Okay. So Indian narrative for me means that you have to have some discussion about the concerns of Indians, the same way you would have concerns of Africans and the indigenous people and so on. So for instance, if I say, look, we have a concern, that the armed forces, for instance, should reflect the population. So you wouldn't have a person like Ogunseye make a statement like, well, the armed forces should turn their guns, towards the people who are not within the government. In other words, to change the government, so to speak. That is a concern for me. And this is the last point I want to make about the Indian narrative. I don't see it very prominent in any of the discussions that we have, because there are people who may not understand that it is important to have an Indian narrative. If you look, and again, this can be simplified, if you look at let's say David Hines' show, for instance, they have a defined African narrative. Now, it would be very extreme in certain areas, certain aspects, but the point is they have a narrative. That means they have certain concerns. So I'm going to leave this question here and hopefully we can discuss it. What does that Indian narrative really mean for us? And how do we make it part of this national dialogue, right? This discussion we're having, especially since we are living in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. And how do we bring our concerns as Indians to the table to ensure that our interests are recognized and protected?
So Dr. Dev, Professor Ramarak pointed out that we are Guyanese, we are Indians. One does not preclude the other from being the other, and went on to define a little bit of the narrative. You want to amplify on that?
Yeah, what I'd like to do is to look at that word narrative. People might commonly think of it as a story, narrative. When I was a boy, there was a book we had to study, a book of narrative verse. And, we got used to the word narrative as telling a story in different ways. In that case, it was poetry. But behind that word is a lot of baggage that must be unpacked, which is that we human beings, we are driven to explain what is happening to us, whether it is happening through the actions of others or through some volcano exploding and having an effect on us. One would be events, one would be, occurrences. We form narratives The human beings tries to explain what is happening through the stories. So the moment we are born into this world, we are raised by our parents. We quite unconsciously adopt certain narratives of why things happen to us. When something happened, this is the reason why. And when something new happened, we have a narrative into which we try to fit it in. So if, for instance, after David Hines and others made some speeches about the killing of an African youth on the East Coast, and they used a certain kind of rhetoric, that rhetoric we predicted fell into a narrative pattern they had created, which is that almost all of the problems of the African Guyanese society is due to the actions of Indian Guyanese. That is a narrative that they have spun. So when they try to explain what was happening or what happened to that young African youth on the East Coast, their explanations, their narrative fit into that preconceived notion. So even though it was the police who had killed the young man, that police was directed by Indian overlords. And so that went, and what happened, we then predicted that if you use a particular language within your narrative, you can expect certain actions to flow out of it. And for years and years, we've been warning that in our plural society, if your narrative is to blame the other for whatever is happening to you, then you should not be surprised or pretend to be surprised when violence is inflicted on those who are causing you harm, who are putting all this pressure due to your narrative. And lo and behold, you had Monrepo. You had the beatings of Monrepo, the beatings of Indians at Monrepo. What I want to then bring to a head is this whole notion of narrative, that all of us create narratives. So there's an African narrative, African Guyanese narrative, there's an Indian Guyanese narrative, there's an Amerindian Guyanese narrative. I accept Beto's distinction between your citizenship, which gives you the rights to your country bestows, and your cultural heritage, which is very internal to your identity and which helps you to create a narrative to negotiate our way in the world. So narratives are formed offer two functions that we should hone in on. One, it explains the world, right? Why aren't we in the police force? Some people would say, well, those Indians don't want to apply, they don't want to get low pay. Another one, the Indian narrative, will tell you, well, historically, we were forced to not join the force through certain criteria, where you had to have a certain height, a certain breast chest measurement, and so on. And therefore, after 100 years, we didn't see the police force as a place to be. So those are two narratives that conflict with each other. So the narratives can then be used to explain, and we can see they can conflict in their explanations. The other one, and this is critical, that narratives also are normative. They tell you what to do, because if you listen to those programs that David Hines and those individuals have over in that Facebook channel, almost every one of them will attract callers who will suggest that the way to resolve the African problems in Guyana is to use the army and the police force and use force to settle matters. About a year ago, we had Ogunse, who is now, I understand, a co-leader of the WPA, a new co-leader, and he explicitly pointed out that with the composition of the armed forces. If African Guyanese want to remove the present PPP government, then all they have to do is not turn their guns on them as they do what they have to do. So to summarize in a word, the Indian Guyanese narrative in Guyana should both explain the situation that they have found themselves and also to prescribe what ought to be done in Guyana. And this is where we differ to those on the other side, like those of the David Hines and his crew. We have pointed out a crucial distinction in narrative and narrative making. And we have said that if you are in a plural society, your narratives must not be one-sided, must not only tell your story, but must include the other. Because if you don't, then you will always have conflict because you're not looking at matters with a balanced perspective. And I would like to conclude at this point on that note.
Right. So just to summarize, Ravi Dev says that a narrative is a story, but it's not a Nancy story as we understand as Nancy's story where growing up. It's an explanation for an event, a cause for an event. And every group has their own narrative. In the past, the dominant group used to tell the narrative. The dominant group used to write the narrative. And as we become educated and schooled, people from their own ethnic groups start telling their own narrative, which may or may not be in conflict or contradiction with the narrative that was historically presented. Professor Ramarak, anything else to add to that?
Well, but I think it's important since we're talking about narrative, right? We started out this conversation talking about, that narrative is coming from the Indian experience, just as how the indigenous narrative should be from their own experience, and same thing for the African narrative. So, but I do want to point out, and I think this is important for us to do, because this is the argument that is being made on the other side, which is that that the Indian narrative is promoted, defended by the current government of Guyana. So I want to make that distinction very clear. Now, Ravi can speak for himself. I am not a defender of the PPP, right? The Indian narrative, as far as I'm concerned, is not being protected by the PPP. The PPP does not claim to be an Indian political party, even though the majority of Indians vote for the PPP. So the problem is the other side, and I think you would see that David Hines and Ogunsi and all of those folks would like to say that we, by defending an Indian narrative, are defending the PPP. We're not doing that. That's not what we're about. We're saying we have specific interests, and I would go to the extent to say that there is no way where we can say that the PPP is, in a sense, overtly defending and protecting that Indian narrative in the way that folks like David Hines and others are promoting and defending the African narrative. Here's an example. We have been calling for years and years to have the word Indian attached to Indian arrival. We have been calling for a balancing in the discipline force. Those things are not happening. But the problem is when you don't extol that narrative, and I don't know who in this government, in a sense, would talk about an Indian narrative. That seems to be absent, right? The other side have a whole bunch of organizations that address their narrative in very different nuanced way. But we don't have a specific Indian organization in Guyana today. And I would also argue that part of that reason is because traditionally, historically, Indian organizations that extol that sort of Indian narrative were clenched, they were suppressed, right? They were not given that freedom to express. For whatever reasons, we can talk about that. But again, the danger when we don't have that Indian narrative, where Indians are not given a chance to express what they really believe in, the danger is those who have a narrative and are promoting that narrative are the ones who are going to have their narrative dominate the political scene. I'll give you a perfect example. On this very show, a couple of weeks back, Vincent Alexander, who was with GCOM, gave a very detailed explanation, which he argued using examples of what the government may be doing in terms of using passport and birth certificates and so on, in a sense, to register people who are coming from Suriname and Venezuela in preparation for the incoming election. The point is, if Vincent is aware of those things, he should take that and make that a legal issue. But the important point is this, because we don't have that in the narrative, is that many of those people who are returning from Suriname, some of them are my family, who are coming from Venezuela, are people who have Guyanese lineage. They have a legal right to be here. And we can't forget the fact that it was in the 1980s and so on, when many of those people left Guyana. They were, in a sense, forced to leave, a lot of them, because they were trying to find, make a living in other places. So those people have a right to come back. In a sense, to borrow a phrase from, one of the African leaders here in the United States, the chickens are coming home to roost. So you can't prevent that from happening. But the point is, if we don't have a narrative that explains that reflect upon these things. I'll give you one more example. There's a whole discussion with Eric Phillips about land. You may have seen the back and forth in the newspaper about reparations and so on. We don't have a problem with reparations, right? But if we're going to accept what David Hines and others have said, that we can talk about, every group in Guyana, but we can't speak for the indigenous people, and Indians can't speak for Africans, fair enough. But you don't have that authority or that moral high ground to tell Indians that, okay, well, indentureship wasn't as bad as slavery. Maybe that is true, but that discussion, that narrative should come from Indians who are part and parcel of that experience, right? And I think if we can get to that point to recognize the history that each others bring to the table and recognize that everybody's narrative have a meaning, it means that we can probably move very closer to having that national narrative that Ravi is talking about. But that doesn't also mean that you have to give up your own narrative. That has to be there, and that has to be part of the definition of who we are. So if you were to ask Walter Rodney, somebody did, how do you define yourself? He said, look, I am Guyanese, right? That's a citizenship. I'm a Black man. I'm from the Caribbean. I share a culture with Africa. So we are complex. So when people say to us, well, you can't talk about, being Indian and so on, that could be racist. And again, they are, and again, I'm not trying to insult anyone, but there are people who will say, even Indians will say, well, that's being stupid. You're Guyanese, you're not Indian. So when those statements are being made, it means that you are ignoring that long tradition, that history that defines who you are. And again, the simple point to all of this is that everybody should come to the table with their own narrative. And I've made the argument many times on this show that we don't have many Indians who make that argument, who forcefully, right, articulate that Indian narrative, because we don't have Indian organizations, right, and we don't have people within the Indian community who are willing, to step forward and say, well, we have some, but not a lot, who are willing to step forward and say, look, you guys want to talk about, all the stuff about slavery and all these things that happened. Well, there was a place called Wisma. There were land that was taken away from people who were driven out. What about that narrative? Who's going to talk about that? So it is important for us to talk about all of those things, and you can't deny one people their narrative and try to promote your own narrative, your own history as the most important in a country that is represented, right, by many people coming from different cultural backgrounds.
As Dr. Ramrat rightly pointed out, there's no one in the PPP administration that has advocates a narrative for Indians. The people who are advocating Indian narratives are Ravindra Dev, Betram Ramarak, myself, a few other Indian writers. You wanna amplify on that, Ravindra Dev?
Well, and this is where it is, a lot.
And if I may interrupt, David Granger, before he became president and during his presidency as well as after, he has been advocating an African narrative, and he's not shameful or bashful about it. He does it courageously and bold, as he should. Why shouldn't he? Why shouldn't he tell the narrative of his African roots?
The man has co-authored a book on African history in Guyana. But to answer your story, and it's important for our listeners, our viewers, whom we suspect may be mostly of Guyanese Indian descent, as to how this state of affairs came about, that we don't have this Indian narrative as firmly entrenched as the African Guyanese narrative. Because narratives, like I said, are always there for you to explain your situation. So when we were brought from India and thrown into the plantations, those individuals had to have created a narrative to explain their situation. They had to have created a narrative. And if you go back, and there are now tomes written about this, that they did have a narrative. And part of that narrative was constructed based on their experiences both in India and in Guyana. So when they talk about themselves, take for example Chetty Jagan, who I will point out was the individual who, when he entered Guyanese politics, and we're talking about the Indian Guyanese and Guyanese politics, the narrative of Guyanese politics, he was the man who changed this whole notion of what is our narrative. But he begins his book by locating himself as if you're doing a puja. When you begin a puja, you have to locate yourself very precisely in the country you're in the district you're in the gown or village that you're in, and position yourself geographically and based on your heritage, your inheritance. He mentions he was of Kurmi stock in his first thing. He talks about being born not far from Allahabad, where Jawaharlal Nehru, his hero, was born. So the point is that he observed those forms to create a narrative, and he also used a phrase that his mother would always say, looking back at the identity narrative. He summarized it in one sentence, that his mother would always tell him, "Be proper punish, bhai. Be proper punish." Now here it is, his mother and his father, his mother and his grandmother, his nanny, his mother and his nanny, and his father and that mother, the Aji, both came on a ship together and would have experienced what it meant to be on that ship. And the fact that those two ladies kept their promise made on that ship to marry their two children to each other is an aspect of that narrative. We call it the Jahaji Bhai or the Jahaji Behin aspect of our narrative, that our identity started to be formed in the depots of India, and on the ships as we came, and then on the plantations of Guyana. So that narrative was there. So there was an Indian narrative. And if you go back to 1938, by which time Dr. Jagan was in America furthering his education, there was the 100th anniversary of Indian indentureship, Indian arrival. And we saw all of the Indian intellectuals and all of the Indian leaders who were primarily business people. They were the leaders, the Kewals and all the other people in Georgetown who were businessmen. They had that, and they had a narrative created which they published, and Dr. Betoram has reissued this publication. which gives you an Indian narrative up to 1938, that first 100 years. So it's not that we didn't have a narrative, but as we entered modern times, Dr. Jagan returns from America in 1943. 5 years later, he returns from America. He has been exposed to this new narrative called Marxism-Leninism. He had brought back a blue-eyed Bhauji, who was also steeped in that narrative. And together, they explicitly preached that the Indian narrative was backward. We have a new narrative that will explain everything. It will explain, that's the first part of a narrative, and it will also tell you what to do, the normative aspect. And the way to go about it is that to look after not Indian interests or whatever interest, you must look after your class interests. So if Indians were excluded from the armed forces, don't bother with that. That's a racist, racial way of looking at things. No, your class interest is who is using the police force. So I would like to make this is not in any way blaming Dr. Jagan. Marxism was then a rising doctrine in all of the third world after Russia had its revolution in 1917. So it was almost a wave, the feeling of that era, and he adopted it. But we must understand where he was coming from and understand where, upon his arrival on the political sphere, an Indian narrative was frowned upon by our political leaders.
Excellent. So now let's talk about the Indian narrative in politics, because basically Ravi Dev is saying, under Chetty Jagan, there really was no Indian narrative in the politics. It was a class narrative in the politics. Dr. Ramrak.
Well, we're not suggesting that, Chetty was totally oblivious, even with all the things he were doing politically. He did understand the Indian history, but in his book, the first sentence in his book, he did say also that I know very little about my people's history. But he understood, Indian history from the perspective of people who were, conquered, African history also. He may have been much more enamored by the experience of Indians in the Sharia state. And I can say the same thing about Barnum coming out of Kitty, would not have understood the Indian experience in the rural area because he was a city boy. But I want to kind of fast forward with this whole idea of a narrative. We understand the history of it and where Chetty and so on stood. But I think, we have to kind of focus on where we are currently. And by saying what I'm going to say, I'm not trying to knock anyone, but I am hard pressed, to look at people who are in government. And naturally, if you see someone who is Indian, you would expect that they show some concern or some understanding for that lack of an Indian narrative today. And I don't see, let's say, people who are governing the country, and I can call names, I don't know anyone who could have this kind of conversation that we're having here today. Because somehow I think, aside from the lack of that understanding, but let me backtrack a little bit. See, when we talk about politics, whatever we're doing here today, it comes from years. I'm not saying, me and Dev or Vishnu are the smartest fish in the barrel. We have spent our lives looking at politics, looking at Guyana, right? And I have written a lot about Guyana. If I get, sick, I'm not going to go to a guy who's a political scientist. I'll go to a medical doctor. So politics is also a science. So we've spent a lot of time looking at Guyana. And at the same time, I think it's also important to point out that we are not like a lot of people who are in the business of writing. Rodney was a person, and again, I'm not comparing ourselves to Rodney. Rodney was a person who was busy writing. Even when Barnum was chasing him in the streets of Georgetown, Rodney was coming up with things he could write about his experience, right? He was working on the history of Guyana. My point is, he was an activist. He took the ideas that he was learning about and tried to understand. So when we come on a show like this, this is the activist side of us that's speaking. So therefore, we have that tendency to analyze. So when we say there's a lack of an Indian narrative within the current government, for instance, it means that we don't see anyone who will take the challenge and publicly make some statements like that, like what we were seeing today, like the army must be balanced, right? Janet Jagan complained when she resigned as Minister of Home Affairs that she had no control, right? But if you are learning from that experience, why not apply that experience and try to make modification, right? Why not address Indian concerns as you would hear statements coming out from, let's say, the Prime Minister or the police commissioner, who always say, well, I'm proud as an African. So we don't hear those things, right? And I can tell you from interviews that I've done, again, it goes to the Indian mentality that, first to begin, we're not au fait. We don't understand the importance of these things. And secondly, there's that belief that's drilled into our heads that you can't talk about Indians. It's a racist thing to do, right? We have been accused of the same things, again, by Indians who don't understand what we're trying to do. So it's all about being educated. It's an education process. Fast forward now to where we are, right? 2024. Because of the lack of this concern publicly, you can have people, like Nigel Hughes can go on television in 2022 and present data that convinced everyone that Indians are the privileged community in Guyana. They own all the business, they get all the contract, but nothing is mentioned about, the poor rural farmer outside of Georgetown, the person who's, eking out a living as a farmer. So you don't have those things being discussed, right? And based on where we are today, because we don't have that Indian perspective being addressed, right? We are now putting Indians in a situation where we have to kind of backpedal, right? Because others accusing us, as they're doing, for instance, they would accuse us of being, part of a conspiracy to deny them their rights and so on. A typical example, there are those who would say, well, we supported power sharing. Right, we supported power sharing in the 80s when we had discussions with folks in the PNC. David Hines today will say, "Well, what happened to those guys? They were once talking about power sharing, but when we address power sharing, we are saying, look, it means that you can share power, right? You can create institutions that recognize the ethnicity of other people. You can talk about, proportional representation. You can talk about allocation of contract, right? You can talk about balancing the armed forces and so on, right? And you can talk about having a caucus, all of those things. We have not abandoned those things. The big difference is when they talk about power sharing, they're talking about controlling the entire pie. It's not necessarily sharing the corn, right? Look at what David Hines did, right? In the last election, he was on the list, burn the ballots, right? And create a government around, not around Irfan Ali, but around David Granger, right? Eric Phillips is talking about, and he has been on Globaspan, he has indicated that if they don't get what they're asking for, then partition is something that they will consider, right? So that is where their narrative is going. For them, power sharing means it's all or nothing. So when they talk about power sharing, it means that they want to control power. So they will attack everybody, every Indian, of being wealthy without understanding and acknowledging. Well, they do understand. They don't acknowledge that the wealth that Indians have developed over the years, over generations, were based on sacrifices that they made, sacrifices that their families made, right? The previous generation, right? I'm not saying all Indians are angels. They are corrupt Indians like everything else. And we have been, we have addressed those issues in the past. We've talked about corruption. We've talked about the fact that, yes, this is not a perfect situation in which we're living, right? We can't have people being shot in the middle of the night, right, by policemen. We have condemned all of those things. We're not living in a perfect society. But the point is, if those narratives are not presented to challenge what is being challenged right now, it means that we are looking at a situation come 2025 where that narrative that they are presenting, that all Indians are racist, right? All Indians support the PPP is corrupt, the PPP is racist, the PPP is dominating Indians, right? And they want to destroy the African community. It means that that narrative will become a dominant narrative in society without being challenged. It means that they now have access to people outside of Guyana who can influence, right? We all know what happened, when the protests took to the streets, and it's not something that you can argue that will not happen. We've seen it in 1998 when the protests erupted. I think this is what the opposition would like to have, right, come this election. I think they sense that the PPP, given the resources that they have, will win the election. But the question is, what do they do next? So we have an example, 1998, where people took to the streets, right? And they try to cut down the life of that government. And they try to push themselves and bully themselves to either share government, in other words, trying to get in through the back door, right? So they have now ignored everything we have seen that have changed in Guyana. The idea that Indians are not the majority as they were in the 1980s, when we talked about addressing the ethnic security dilemma, right? The swing votes are still there. Indians may be about 35% of the population today. So they can win in an election, they can participate, but you can't rule that out. But I do believe that because of the narrative that they're spreading, they're creating a dangerous situation that if we don't get what we want, then you're going to have a lot of trouble in this country. And I think that's the danger of that narrative. And I think that's not being addressed effectively, from our side.
And not only from the Indian intellectuals, but from the PPP as well. Ravindra Dev?
Well, we come back to our topic, which is Indian Guyanese narrative in Guyanese politics. So I want us to keep on contextualizing what we're talking about. So our listeners out there, not only our Indian listeners, our Indian Guyanese, but Guyanese of other ethnicities can also listen to the way what has happened to us. So I would pick up on what Dr. Betoram talked about, the security dilemmas. And this is where we come back to the fact that we just will not only speak about one side. We may speak for one side, but we have to speak of the other sides, so to speak. So when I pointed out to Eric Phillips that he is misusing the word reparations when he says that Amerindians got the land that they are now getting title to through reparations, I am speaking not for our Amerindian brothers and sisters, but to fill in a lacuna in their narrative, that it wasn't so. So coming back to our own narrative and the lacunas that has been presented, when we spoke about our ethnic security dilemma, what was that? That was the fact that throughout our history, the forces of the state were used to oppress, suppress, and to exclude us from real power in Guyana. And politics is all about power. You may have some money, but at the best you have what is called influence. You will influence somebody because, man, I will give you something. But real power is possessed when you have the political wherewithal to command the institutions of the states, like the army, the police, the bureaucracy, the civil service, and all the other institutions that go along. And those have never been in Indian hands. Historically, when the British were ruling, they exclude the Indians. They wanted to keep us down on the plantations to supply cheap labor. Imagine our wage rate was 1 shilling at the beginning of indentureship in 1838 and the same 1 shilling at the end in 1917, and didn't increase much because we went plump into the depression. But to come back to that, we were not the holders of power. We didn't even have the vote. We couldn't even have the vote. So even though we were about 41% of the population by the 1930s and 40s, we had maybe 6% of us were qualified to vote. So we did not have political power. And that is very important. So up comes independence, handed to Mr. Burnham, handed to him on a platter. And I see Mr. Granger, our historian, who was schooled at our expense because he went to UG on a scholarship when he was security minister, official under Hoyt. The point is, though, that he's writing as we speak about that era, and he never mentions the fact that the CIA, it has been documented, handed power to Burnham, who was on the CIA payroll. So when Burnham took over, he not only continued the oppression of Indians through the institutions of the state, but he buttressed those institutions. So he then increased the percentage and absolute numbers of African Guyanese in the armed forces, multiplied the armed forces exponentially. He then went into the civil service, expanded that through a regional system by a percentage of 10,000 or so. He then went into the area we were at least had a toehold, which was petty retailing. And he formed something called the External Trade Bureau, which now controlled all importation of goods and doled out whatever goods through something that he had to have a sense of humor. He called the Knowledge Sharing Institute. So you had to go and beg to buy goods to sell through his Knowledge Sharing Institute. And to show you where he was coming from, Linden had about 5 centers, while the whole of West Amarara had 1, right here in Kashmir, where I live, not far from Kashmir. The point I want to make is that Indians, their security dilemma comes out that even if they were to attain political office, if they were to attain political office through their numbers, as we pointed out in the 80s, they will not have political power. There was what we call the principle of anticipated reaction. The PPP has always had to say, before doing a single thing, what them go do. What them go do. They had to anticipate what would happen if they were to act in a particular way. And what they did always, and this is the greatest irony, they tried to pander to African Guyanese at the expense of Indian Guyanese, but it never worked. It always backfired because they were not willing to show the figures as to how they were taking care of African Guyanese. It was not until I entered Parliament, the 8th Parliament between 2001 and 2006, that I exposed the fact that the PPP was still subsidizing electricity for all of Linden, which was primarily African Guyanese, and yet had cut back on the subsidy for water on the sugar plantations, even though all of the infrastructure was paid for through what is called a Sugar Industry Labor Welfare Fund. Those wasn't built by the government. That was built by our own money, which went back into that. Yet the government took out those subsidies and we had to begin to pay water bills. So what the point I want to make is that when we talked about power sharing, right, we were talking about sharing real power. For you to bring into the government as part of the executive coming from the PNC. So you have a PNC minister and a PPP minister sitting side by side. And all of the institutions are supporters of the PNC, the army, the police. When you, the PPP minister, presses that button, you think anybody on the end will listen? Never. It's never going to happen. PNC minister would then have absolute power because he would have what is called the authority that the state gives him to be a minister, and also the power that the institutions give him. So coming back to David Hines and others talking about we abandoned power sharing, we have never abandoned power sharing. They have always only considered power sharing on one aspect, executive power sharing. They wanted the icing on the cake, but the whole cake would have remained in their hands. So when they get the icing, what are we left with? To use the famous words of our ex-president Don Ramutar, we would have gotten, excuse the term, larva.
Yeah, Katahar.
No, larva, he's a larva.
Yeah, okay. Well, but it's important to remind David Hines and others that we still believe in those power sharing principles, and ROAR has those listed. We've talked about, and I've seen Eric Phillips I don't think he understood what it means. We've talked about federalism, right? A federalized or a system that devolves power, take it away from the center and give it to the local community so that they can determine what is best with their community. We've talked about, and I see they've picked it up, Nigel Hughes, this whole notion of having data, to look at ethnic impact statement. That's another form of, a way of addressing the issues we talk about. Balancing, but that's something I even looked at the emancipation show that they had. They simply brushed off this whole idea that we've been talking about balancing, focusing on the fact that Africans don't have economic wealth. Well, that's something we have also advocated, right? We talk about affirmative action. But the other thing to remember, and for those who might be listening to us, it's important for us to also ask the question, what if the PPP were to lose in 2025? Where does that leave us if the opposition win? Well, the danger is that since we don't have that Indian narrative being talked about, it means that we are in a situation where our interests will not be represented. It was the Black Power movement in Trinidad, where the folks in the army and the police rebel against Eric Williams, primarily Africans. So Eric Williams felt that it's time to balance those forces. So if that scenario happens in 2025, we do have to raise that question, right? So it behooves us to look at some of those power arrangement mechanisms we've talked about. It's about time that we look at the security force. It's about time that we bring in communities and empower them, whether it's the indigenous community, empower them with real power, right? So that they can have a meaningful impact on what happens. So all of those power sharing mechanisms are still, and we have been very consistent about them. They're still in place. We still support them. So those things have to be addressed. But again, it is important that we address those issues so that the narrative, which speaks to each community's interests, can be represented, right? So that we can kind of go forward and develop this country as a unified nation, as opposed to some of the, the language and the rhetoric that's coming from the other side and the proposals they're making, right? So based on that extremely radical rhetoric, we have to wonder if they do get in 2025, what is going to happen to that Indian narrative, which does not really exist at this point, right? To speak up in terms of our interests. Is that going to be respected? And if it's not being debated, it's not in the public domain, chances are it's not going to be addressed.
So Dr. Dev, Mr. Dev, how do we get to an Indian narrative now to address that issue, that the challenge that Professor Ramraj just raised?
Well,
and if you may summarize this whole concept of the Indian narrative and politics, that we can close off.
yeah. I think, as we have said, out of the goodness of his heart, Dr. Jagan tried to avoid having an Indian narrative because he felt the Marxist narrative was a superior one, which would lead to equity and equality in Guyana. It did not. And Marxism, Leninism has thankfully been abandoned by the PPP. And I expect if function follows form, we should begin to see the emergence of narratives within the PPP that includes an Indian narrative. We have suggested to them that they allow within the PPP, just like within the PNC, that they should allow the narrative of the other to be subsumed within the party as caucuses. So the PPP, we felt, should have an African caucus where they talk about African issues outside African PPP members, speak about African issues outside of the main party, but present those issues to the party. Similarly, in the African area. Sadly, when in the new dispensation of APNU, when people like Ganesh Maipal, Pandit Upraj Narayan, and other Indians in them spoke out against a racist statement by a WPA member on a program, they were castigated by David Hines and called slave catchers, meaning Hines sees his politics and the politics of the opposition, that even if you're Indian, you must shut your mouth, even though Indians are insulted or even molested within the PNC. That's the kind of multiculturalism they see. But to come back to the PPP, let us see if they will evolve. They talk the language of inclusion, and we feel they should make that additional step of acknowledging ethnic narratives and allow the different stories to be told within the ambit of a one Guyana. Now, to come back to another contradiction, what we spoke about in federalism, which continues to be knocked. We see that the opposition, all of the opposition, keep on complaining about the central government insisting on controlling all of the local government organs down to the NDCs. Well, what else do you expect? That is called decentralization. Decentralization accepts having a center, and you're simply shifting power down away from that center. But what is the mechanism of that shifting? That mechanism has no enforcement. Federalism is the only mechanism which introduces the notion of competencies, that the central government has certain competencies. It then can act in that area. Take, for example, in America, it is the state and the municipalities that have the competency in education. So they control education totally down to the school system, as both of you know, having worked in that school system. That is the notion of competencies. So the opposition can jump high and jump low, but until they are willing to accept the notion of federalist mechanisms in Guyana, they will never have that. Secondly, to show the one-sidedness that they have, they refuse to condemn Burnham for destroying the greatest contribution to politics in Guyana, the village system, and out of the village movement. The village council movement, out of the village movement. Burnham destroyed that by agglomerating villages into NDCs. By the structure of Guyana, we are on a linear one road throughout the country. These villages, like from Tushin to Iflat, is my NDC. I don't know anybody in Tushin. 7 miles away? Nobody knows. I know IFLUT. IFLUT has Africans and Indian Guyanese. And if we were still a village with a village council, then we would have collaborated and cooperated and become one based on our own private needs. And that can only come upon the villages should have the competencies to govern. And the whole essence of this is called subsidiarity, which is that decisions, according to the truest democracy, must be made at the lowest level. Well, you see, this lot in the opposition, especially the lot represented by this new WPA that is totally Afrocentric. They want to have everything, and they think they're being very clever to couch it by merely using words. Power sharing, just to have the executive control the other power centers that are there. To have decentralization, but yet the villages must have the competency to make their own decision because they want the African villages to get back some measure of autonomy. And you could go down the line with this. They want to have their cake and not only eat it, but eat it with icing on top. Ain't gonna happen, and that is my conclusion. But we have to be very frank. So coming back to an Indian narrative, that Indians, and we are not from the PPP, as Dr. Beto Ram said. I was in opposition to the PNC when I was to the PPP when I was in Parliament. And what we are saying very clearly, whether Indians are members of the PNC, whether they're members of the PPP, whether they are members of any other whatever political organization, they have to begin to understand that in a plural society, they must have an Indian narrative. But we call upon the Indian narrative must be inclusive. It must not in any way seek to disempower any other group. That's my closing statement.
One of the important things about what we're discussing here today is that when you reflect and we talk about how that narrative was different on the Chetty Jagan and so on, but when you reflect, when you have an Indian perspective and you focus on that Indian narrative, you can also reflect on what happened in the past, right, and how things shape. So when we talk about the WPA, the narrative coming out from the WPA is that this was a very multiracial, multi-ethnic political party, but the question has to be raised, and from hindsight, we know what Rodney was about. Rodney could have tied rings. He was so smart around the minds of everybody and every Indian leader in that WPA. So who represented the Indian narrative in that so-called multiracial political party? Was it Rupert Rupnarayan? He didn't have any kind of Indian narrative that I'm aware of. In fact, this was a guy who felt that we took out a newspaper ad calling us racist, right? Was it Moses Bhagwan? Was he? Did he represent an Indian perspective comparable to what people like Rodney was promoting and understood to be the Indian narrative? So we have to question these things, and I think if we understand that Indian narrative, we can also reflect upon the fact, since we have an election coming up, that this whole mess that we find ourselves in, talking about ethnic division and rigged election and so on, that the opposition seems to be concerned. They were the ones who created the first political sin, so to speak, because they began to rig election. They began to deny this whole notion of ethnicity, right? They began to suppress people, right? So therefore, when we talk about that Indian narrative, we also have to look at the historical development of that narrative. And it is important, as Ravi is saying, that we are now in a situation where we can't just say we're one Guyana, one Guyana, one Guyana. And saying that, which might be okay if we're talking about citizenship, but we can't ignore the Indian voice and the Indian interest in all of this. And that has to be addressed, right? The Indian concerns, as everybody else is concerned, whether it's indigenous or African and so on.
With that, we'll let that be the final word. We'll end early tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching us, listening to us tonight. And thank you, Devin, for being the technical operator. You are watching Globespan 24/7.